Okay, hands-on halacha, here we go. So we spent a couple weeks discussing the halachos of the early morning, and we focused on zmanim in terms of sunrise, daybreak, and then there's a time in between those two known as mishi yakir, which literally means when you can recognize. And there's two different ways it's described, but they mean the same thing. When you can recognize the difference between your blue strings and your white strings and your tzitzis, and when you can recognize an acquaintance at a distance of 4 amos, not a very close friend, but not a total stranger, an acquaintance. That is a little bit of light, more than the tiny bit of light that you'll have at daybreak, and not nearly the amount of light that you have at sunrise, but it's a little bit of light, it's somewhere in between. And that time frame is pretty critical as far as halacha is concerned, because it is the time, it's the earliest time for 3 critical early morning mitzvahs, for the mitzvah of talis, the mitzvah of tefillin, and the mitzvah of shema. All 3 of those mitzvahs are supposed to be done after that time frame. Now, each one we explained in previous classes is a little bit different, and that is that talis is a machlokas, whether it's limited by day versus night, or whether it depends on the type of garment, a daytime garment versus a nighttime garment. And therefore, there are those who will say that if it's a daytime garment, it doesn't matter what time it is, you are doing a mitzvah. We have tefillin, which technically, according to the Torah, has no time frame, no limitations, it's day and night. But Chazal, our sages, the rabbis, don't want us wearing tefillin at a time that we're likely to be falling asleep. Because when a person falls asleep, they can't maintain a clean body. So that's why tefillin are supposed to be postponed until Misha Yakir. And then finally, we have Shema. And Shema is a mitzvah that should ideally be done after Misha Yakir, not before that. However, we learned previously that in a dire situation, a person can push it as early as daybreak, okay? And with the tefillin as well, in certain circumstances where a person's traveling on the road or different things of that nature, a person could theoretically put on the tefillin as early as daybreak. So now, when exactly are all of these times? So sunrise is obvious. Daybreak, we learned in the tshuva from Rav Moshe, is the main opinion is 72 minutes. And then the more 72 minutes, means 72 minutes before sunrise. And then the more lenient opinion is that of the Rambam. And Rav Moshe had a bit of a discussion about exactly how to calculate the Rambam's opinion, but his conclusion was to go with 90 minutes before sunrise. Now, in terms of Misha Yakir, we learned of Moshe. Rav Moshe takes a position of 35 to 40 minutes, approximately, before sunrise. And we also learned that the more lenient opinion is for the Sfardim, the Kaf HaChaim, who says 60 minutes before sunrise. And for the Ashkenazim, it's Rav Henkin, who also says 60 minutes before sunrise. That's kind of the spectrum. So the Lechatchila, someone wants to be postponing his talis and tefillin until 35 minutes before sunrise in accordance to Rav Moshe. And if that is difficult, a person can put on his talis and tefillin as early as 60 minutes before sunrise. Okay, so
when you say Sfardim, does that include Nusach Sfard?
No, that means like Iraqis, Persians, Iranians, etc. But we have Rav Henkin, so even the Nusach Sfard folks, who are technically speaking Ashkenazim, though we daven Nusach Sfard, but other than that, we are Ashkenazim. Many times Nusach Sfard people have a Hasidic flair, certain minhagim from Hasidim. But essentially we're Ashkenazim. So we still have Rav Henkin, who is a major Ashkenazic authority in America. And I think I mentioned in this class before that Rav Henkin was behind the printing of the Ezra's Torah Luach. I think I mentioned this before. And this is kind of the go-to book for synagogues and congregations. And as a result, his opinion has become very widely accepted because it's printed there. At least that's my theory. Okay. Now, before I move on to Chanukah, the last thing that I want to share about this whole discussion is I want to reiterate the discussion of minutes versus degrees. We touched on this when we were discussing the time for daybreak. And we discussed the reality, or we discussed the fact that there's two ways one can measure daybreak. There's a fixed number of minutes, such as 72 minutes before sunrise, 90 minutes before sunrise, no matter when, no matter where, whether you're dealing with Cincinnati or Yerushalayim or Anchorage, or whether you're dealing with the winter or the spring or the summer or the fall. Or alternatively, you could use what's called degrees. That's what we spoke about. Which the idea of degrees is that you take Eretz Yisrael as the reference point, which or Babylonia as your reference point. Both are almost identical as far as the discussion of the location of the sun is concerned. You take that as your reference point. And for the record, the reason why that's the reference point is because that is where the Jewish communities lived in Talmudic times. There was the community in Bavel, that was Talmud Bavli, that's Babylonia, modern day Iraq. And then you have, or maybe Iran, and then you have Israel. There's a community in Israel as well. So you take that as reference point, and you take either the spring or the fall season, which is more, it's an equinox, things are more equal. And then you measure the position of the sun 72 minutes before sunrise. And then you use that measurement and you carry that over to wherever you are. So that'll be 16.1 degrees. You take that 16.1 degrees and you measure it out in Cincinnati, Ohio, during the winter, and you're going to end up with much more than 72 minutes. It's going to be earlier than 72 minutes. So that's the idea of degrees. So I want to just stress that the idea of minutes versus degrees applies to Misha Yakir as well. It applies to the time frame for Talis and Tefillin and Shema as well. And it's going to be a similar concept where you'll take 35 minutes, 40 minutes. Now, you know what? Scratch that. Hold that thought. You take the 60 minutes of the Kaf HaChaim in Yerushalayim, and then you measure the degrees of the sun when it's 60 minutes before sunrise. That would be one option. And then you carry over that measurement to Cincinnati, Ohio, to wherever you are, whatever time, and then you determine how long before sunrise that will yield. Rav Moshe, I'm realizing now as I speak, it's not so easy to go ahead and do that because Rav Moshe, certainly you can't use Israel as your reference point. Because if you recall, the way he arrived at his number of 35 or 40 minutes was he simply went outside. He went outside early in the morning in New York, and he determined at what point approximately did he have enough light to tell the difference between blue strings and white strings. At what point did he have enough light to be able to recognize an acquaintance at a distance of 4 amos? So that's going to be specific to New York. So your reference point there, as far as degrees of the sun will be concerned, is going to have to be New York City, not Israel or Bavel. Okay, the Kaf HaChaim, however, he himself was citing the minhag of Yerushalayim. So to use Israel as the reference point would definitely be appropriate. Okay, so now the last thing I want to do is I want to gave you a tool to use. So I've explained to you before about MyZmanim, which is a very useful website. I'm going to share my screen now. So here it is. This is myzmanim.com. Super easy. You just go there, you punch in your zip code, and then they'll produce a whole list of Zmanim for the day. And then up here with these tools, you can adjust what calendar date you want to know the times for. And you can figure out what time you could put on your talus 2 months from now, 5 years from now, very easily. Now,
There's also, Rabbi, there's also an app, if you have a smartphone, called Zmanim.
is it the same? Is it the same group? Or is it a different?
I don't know.
You're making a good point, though, Paul. I'm a little bit outdated. I'm still in the website age.
Okay.
I haven't quite made it over to the app age. But despite my personal age.
Monum has an app as well.
Yeah, I would imagine so. They got to keep up with the times. It's a similar story. I just want to highlight the following. If you take a look, so I went, to the bottom of the page, and I did the expanded Zmanim with all the different opinions. And here are the different opinions that they cite for Mishiyakir. So they have, and if you'll notice, they're all degrees. Every single one of them is a number of degrees of the sun relative to the horizon. Whereas if you look up at daybreak, you have 72 minutes fixed, 72 minutes as degrees, 16.1 degrees. But when it comes to Mishiyakir, when it comes to Talis and Tefillin, they only work with degrees. Now, I took a look at, if you look here, they tell you where they base themselves from. Here's the Rav Moshe that we spoke about and different opinions. Here's a kind of the layout of the different opinions of Talis and Tzitzis and Tefillin, And here are the three that you'll find on their main page. Here's the Kaf HaChaim that we discussed, about 60 minutes. Now, it's important to mention the Kaf HaChaim himself. He is pretty, he says it as 60 minutes. He makes no mention of degrees and of fluctuation over the course of the year. So if you want to strictly follow the Kaf HaChaim, I think it would be legitimate to assume that one should follow a fixed 60 minutes, not degrees of the sun. Something I think is worth noting is that Mishiyakir in particular, it's very logical that we should use degrees instead of minutes. Because when it comes to daybreak, it's in theory, it's possible that there is it's a halachic time which is determined by a fixed number of minutes before sunrise, which is not a stretch of the imagination to say such an idea, because as we mentioned in a previous class, the time for daybreak is based on a Gemara in Pesachim, and the Gemara in Pesachim seems to give a fixed time for it. It gives a time of 4 mil, which you have to determine how long a mil is, and you'll arrive at a certain number of minutes. That's where the 72 minutes comes from. So the Gemara at face value is a number of minutes. The Vilna Gaon says that the Gemara only used a reference of a specific number of minutes with the intention of that number being used by people living in Israel, people living in Bavel and Babylonia. The intention was not for that to be used universally, and that's where the Vilna Gaon argues that really the more accurate way to determine it is a number of degrees below the horizon. But what's I think worth noting is that there's no such Gemara whatsoever that gives a set number of minutes for Mishiyakir, which is why we have so many different opinions about exactly how many minutes for Mishiyakir. The Gemara describes Mishiyakir as an amount of sunlight. That's very clearly the definition of Mishiyakir. It's the amount of light to tell the difference between the blue strings and the white strings. Now, an amount of light, it's very difficult to accept that should be determined by a fixed number of minutes before sunrise, regardless of your location and your time of year. That, in my mind, is nearly impossible to accept such a position, because it doesn't matter how many minutes you are before sunrise. If you don't have if the sun is not in a position to create enough light to tell the difference between the blue strings and the white strings, you didn't make it yet. You're not there yet.
So the geography is important too.
Excuse me?
The geography is important too then.
Yes.
Like your elevation.
Yes, elevation is also important, because elevation will influence the amount of light as far as the sun approaching the horizon is concerned. They have a discussion here regarding elevation. Oh, accounting for elevation, there it is. Shkia times in Yerushalayim are delayed several minutes because of the elevation factor. So what they write here is specific to Yerushalayim.
Oh.
Fascinating. So they make a point here that being that the elevation in Yerushalayim causes a delay of about 3 minutes, for someone to have an opinion that Shabbos ends 40 minutes after sunset in Yerushalayim would really mean 43 minutes after sunset in a region that is at sea level, that does not have elevation. So that's just an important little tidbit. But yes, that affects Mishiyakir as well. So here are the 3 opinions that you'll find on Maizmanim. The Minig Eretz Yisrael is the earliest at 11.5 degrees, and that will vary 50 to 60 minutes before Nate's in Yerushalayim, 56 to 73 minutes before Nate's in New York City. So this will be very, very comparable to the opinion of the Kaf HaChaim and Rav Henkin, coming in at approximately 60 minutes. In Yerushalayim, it's a drop more machmir. In New York City, it's depending on the time of year. It's either a little more machmir, a little more meikol. So those are the zmanim I wanted to share with you. Okay. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this topic of early morning before we move on to Chanukah?
Nope.
You're good.
Yep.
You good to go, Paul?
I'm good.
All right, beautiful. So let's get going. Okay, so Chanukah, the halachos of Chanukah are pretty much all about the menorah. There's a little bit that's relevant as far as davening, but that's pretty much covered, by whatever's happening in shul. Okay, so the first thing to discuss, the first siman in the Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Chanukah, is about the nature of Chanukah in terms of how much of a Yom Tov is it. So the first thing is that during the 8 days of Chanukah, one is not allowed to fast, nor is one allowed to eulogize the deceased. That is because both of those are considered acts of mourning, of affliction, etc. And Chanukah is a joyous time. Now, even though Chanukah is a Yom Tov, and for that reason, it's forbidden to fast, it's forbidden to eulogize. However, it's not a Yom Tov on the level of Sukkot or a Pesach, and therefore we are allowed to do Malacha. There's no restrictions at all about doing malacha. There is, however, a minhag that some women have, not to do malacha while the candles are burning. Now, this particular minhag doesn't mean that while the candles are burning, it's exactly like Sukkot, Pesach, that they can't do any malacha at all. They can't turn on a light. That's not what this means. What this means is that they shouldn't be, as soon as you light the candles, running down to the basement to put in a load of laundry. That type of malacha. To kind of take a break during the time that the candles are burning to focus on the candles. The reason why this minhag was developed specifically for women was because of the idea that the miracle was brought about by women. That they kind of trigger what?
Yehudi,
Yeah, that's
Yehudi.
right. Yehudis.
Wasn't it?
Exactly right. So she kind of got the ball rolling. She got things started, and for that reason, women have this special minhag. Another important thing is that Chanukah and Purim are different. They're similar in that they're both Yom Tovs where malacha is permitted. We're allowed to drive our car, we're allowed to use electricity, etc., etc. The difference is in terms of meals. Chanukah Purim has a special mitzvah of Simchas Purim, and of having a Suda, a Purim meal. Much like a Sukkot or a Pesach, where we have a mitzvah to have a festive meal. Purim is unique in that there is a strong emphasis on drinking alcohol, whatever that means. That we'll maybe discuss that when we get closer to Purim, exactly how to fulfill that mitzvah properly. But that's specific to Purim. Chanukah, there is no, that's not part of the Yom Tov of Chanukah. Chanukah does not have a festive meal component as an official part of the Yom Tov. The focus of Chanukah is, on the contrary, to sing and to praise Hashem, to daven. That's the focus of Chanukah. There's a very famous concept from the Torah, which the Mishnah Berurah and many others quote, which is that the creation of the Yom Tov parallels the purpose or the cause for the Yom Tov. So Purim, where our physical bodies were under attack, Haman wanted to kill every single Jew. So when we celebrate with the body. We celebrate with good food and good drink. That's a focal point of the Purim celebration. Chanukah, however, our physical bodies were not in question, were not in danger. It was our religion, it was our beliefs, that it was our ethics that were in danger, our values. The Greeks would have been very happy if we would have embraced Greek culture and would have abandoned the Torah. They would have been very happy with us, and they would have embraced us and accepted us. Of course, thank God we didn't do that. We stuck to the Torah despite all odds, and God performed miracles, and we were able to survive the Greek Empire and thrive. But because the events of Chanukah were events of our spiritual well-being being under attack, therefore the Yom Tov that was created has an emphasis on the spiritual aspect, not on the physical aspect. So that's why there's no official mitzvah of having a meal, but rather singing and praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the Ramah here in the Shulchan Aruch and Simon Resh Ayin and Siv Beis, he jumps in and he brings an opinion. Yesh Omrim, there are those who say that no, there is a little bit of a mitzvah of having a bigger meal. What's the reasoning? Because there's a whole nother component to Chanukah, which is the idea of Chanukah Samizbeach, that there's the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash. And a dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, you celebrate with a meal. So therefore, there is an idea of eating special, having special food for Hanukkah. The Ramah, because this seems to be a somewhat questionable point, the Ramah offers a suggestion. The Noagim, the custom is Lomar Zmiros Ushivachos Besudas Shemar B'Mehem. The minhag is to sing and to praise during these meals that we have during Chanukah. V'oz havi su'udas mitzvah. That will make the meal into a mitzvah meal. If the meal incorporates singing and praising Hashem, so then you're sitting down to praise Hashem, and you're having a special food at that gathering, or whatever you want to call it. So that's a way to kind of cover your bases, as it were, and to make it appropriate for Hanukkah. One last interesting minhag, which is brought up in this siman regarding food, is that the Ramah mentions Yesh Omrim. You know what? Let me pause and let me not spill the beans. If I were to ask you, what food is there? Do we have a minhag to eat on Hanukkah? What would you say?
Vodka.
Dairy.
Okay, very good. So
Is it
Paul said
Yehudi?
latkes. Chaim said dairy, and probably if somebody else was talking, they would say donuts, right?
Sufganiyot, yeah.
You got it. Okay, so I think the more known minhag, so the answer is that you're both right. What's interesting is which one is sourced in the Ramah and which one came about from different places at different times. So the latka and the sufganiyot, that's much more well known. Excuse me, but that's not something that's quoted in the Ramah at all. That's something that developed later. And the idea there is, as we know, their food's fried in oil reminds us of the mitzvah, the miracle of the oil. However, Chaim said dairy. So that's right here in the Ramah. The Ramah writes that Yeshomim, that those who say that there is a minhag to have cheese on Chanukah. Why? Because the miracle came about through cheese. Because Yehudis fed cheese to this fellow, this Greek official, to make him sleepy, and then she cut off his head. Second.
Wasn't the general?
Yes, the general, yeah.
I thought the cheese made him thirsty and then he imbibed in alcohol. Oh, no, that's not it.
Yeah,
Good
that's
question.
right.
Yeah, I mean, the way, yeah, it's interesting. The way the Mishnah Berurah brings it down, he doesn't mention that. He says, "Ve'achila l'rosh hatzorim," she fed the general of the armies, givina l'shachroso, cheese to intoxicate him. So I'm not sure if that means that the cheese itself made him sleepy and that's the intoxicating, or she fed him cheese to intoxicate him through alcohol. That certainly would make more sense. For Chatchas Rosh, she cut off his head. Ubaruchu Kulam, they all ran away. So there you go. So that's the cheese. I'll just end off with one really fascinating tidbit about the latke. I once heard, I never really did extensive research of my own, but I once heard from a reliable source that the potato latke is a result of Jewish evolution. And what I mean by that is that originally the minhag was a cheese latke because of this Ramah, this idea. But then we ended up with the majority of the Jewish population in areas like Poland and Russia. And in those communities, or let me work backwards. How do you fry cheese latke? Olive oil, right? What else would you fry it in? when the Jewish community moved its way into Poland and into Russia and other northern Germany, etc., and they came to much colder, less Mediterranean climates, olives and olive oil in particular was not necessarily available to your average person, certainly not affordable to the average person. And what did they fry all of their food in? Take a guess.
Olive oil.
So if they don't have olives, what do you think they fried their food in?
There are plenty of other oils.
Vegetable, I don't know.
So I don't know how
Animal?
common vegetable oil. I'm sorry.
Animal? Was it animal?
That's right. Yes, you got it. I'll share. Chicken schmaltz. The
Ah,
chicken trimmings. Chicken trimmings was the most common grease product for frying in those communities. Now, if you want to fry cheese latkes and all you have is chicken schmaltz, you've got a big problem, right? It's called basar b'cholov, meat and milk. So they were forced to substitute the cheese with potatoes. Potatoes were probably also much more available and much more affordable to those communities. Especially, there were long stretches of time where the average Jew was extremely poor, and cheese was not affordable. But what did you eat? Potatoes, and more potatoes, right? Potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for supper, potatoes. That's basically what they had. So, so the combination of those two factors of the chicken schmaltz and the proliferation of the potato gave way to the development of the potato latke. And here we are today, and you'll find many more potato latkes than cheese latkes on Chanukah. Some of my friends are happy about that. Some of my friends are not happy about that. And to each his own.